Anu, it's wonderful to see you here and to be here for this long-awaited conversation.
Like,
I'm also feeling quite happy about the gathering of the Smith community as I'm watching in the chat and seeing the class years and the places that we're coming together, we're drawn together for this purpose, from sunny climates and snow and from the West Coast and the East Coast. And it's really exciting to see everybody here and have the chance to talk with you. So we're going to have a conversation. I just want to maybe make a few points, and feel free to add anything you'd like to add, which is basically, this is really improvisational and it's a true conversation. We have a couple of questions that we hope you might find interesting that are on the topic of kind of resilience, change, and standards and sanity in the kind of challenging times that we're facing here. We will leave space at the end, about 15 minutes or so, for conversation and for your questions, so feel free to share them. And Anu, I know you may have questions for me too. We'll see where this takes us. And I'm sure wherever it does will be really rewarding and interesting. And so maybe I could just start with kind of bringing us to this moment in time. I don't know if did you want to say anything else, Anu, before we jump into the questions?
Go ahead.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Just kind of grounding in this moment in time and just recognizing the current moment and how incredibly challenging it seems right now, not only the global pandemic, but kind of economic uncertainty that's resulted. It's a moment of a contentious election season, and what seems to be an escalating mental health crisis tied to those events. Another wave of nationwide protests around racial justice spurred on by the murder of George Floyd. There are just so many things that are happening. It's kind of a relentless wave after wave of kind of change and challenge. And in all kinds of sectors and spaces, from industry to family, COVID has disrupted our work and our lives. So maybe we could start first with, from your perch, kind of, well, first off, how you're managing, and I guess then, like, what are the challenges that you see in front of you, and are there any opportunities here for the ways in which you can imagine lessons learned in the current moment when the pandemic passes, that we might be in some ways better off than we have been before?
Yeah. That was a lot of topics. So
I know. So let's see. Pick anyone.
I'll try to hit some of them, and like you said, I think it is good to have it as a conversation. So firstly, delighted to be here despite the circumstances, and it's always nice to do it in person. But I think that every time I do something like this in this format, I think it's a very stark reminder of how much our lives have changed. In a way that, frankly, my imagination did not run to, doing things like this, living like this, working like this, and navigating life in this format, so to speak. So it's very different, very different. We always talk about business resiliency and the importance of emotional resiliency for leadership, but any simulation you run, nothing really prepares you for what we are living through and going through today. And it's a huge testament to, I think, the resilience that world over people have, that we have managed, maybe not in an excellent way, maybe could have been managed better or whatever it is, but still there is a lot that got done and lives got lived despite everything that is happening around us. While at the same time, there is a lot that happened around us and is happening around us that you look at and say, maybe we should have been better prepared, maybe it could have been managed better. So I think it's mixed emotions. At one level, I feel the human resiliency is just amazing and doesn't cease to amaze me every time, because this is beyond anybody's imagination. And most people rose to that challenge, but on the other side, It's also a very difficult time. And sometimes, though I am by nature an optimistic person, it's hard not to get caught up in it. Just as you were listing it out, I was like, it's just overwhelming in terms of everything that you have to deal with, and everything that the people you manage have to deal with, because everybody is, as it is, the job is hard, and on top of that, you're adding all these dimensions to you and all your loved ones. And so how do you navigate all of that at the same time? And that's hard. And I am very thankful to my team for everything that they do to make it work, and very proud of everything they do.
I think that's great. I guess one thing that I was thinking about as you were starting, where you're talking about this particular format, and I was thinking about how incredibly lucky in some ways we are that we have these technologically based ways of still connecting and working, and as a way to cope with what the pandemic is throwing our way, and yet feeling like the mediation of the screen is difficult in kind of approximating the human connection we're trying to create. I guess, and that's related to, I think, leadership and management too. I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about, like, I don't know what your reactions or thoughts are. We talked a little bit about this, but you were saying in terms of your work is very much, client based, and the same thing at Smith is our classrooms, which are so based in kind of intimate conversations, face to face. Like, what would you say about that piece, about the human connection? What are the ways in which you've been able to manage it, maybe creatively, and then other ways it's just felt like a little frustrating?
Yeah, no, you are right about what a difference technology has made. That if we, and hopefully one never has to go through something like this, but if you do, it is a lot more palatable to do it with the technological tools we have today than without. And even if it is, I'm originally from India and I have a lot of family there still, and I know the video technology on the phone existed and that you could do Zoom calls even before, but now I use them a lot more because it's just become a bit more comfortable. It's a more comfortable format. And I think that is a permanent change that has happened, that people will use video technology more. And maybe in the future, you may travel a little less than we did before. I was just reminded that when you think about our time at Smith, where we didn't have all this technology, and if you said, what is Smith? Certainly a very important part of Smith is the classes that you go to and the faculty and the education you get. But another big element of Smith is the friends you make, the connections you make, the tea that you have in your houses, that camaraderie, the late night conversation, the spontaneous conversations. And how do you replicate that in a virtual environment? There is an essence of a lot of that you can do still through online classes and instruction and groups and interaction you can, but there is such a large element of, at least for me, what Smith meant, and I'm sure for you, that was about the experience of being there and being with the others and living through that and making lifelong friendships. So I worry about that part of life being diluted. And I think the same thing happens at work. We describe it at our organization as creative combustion, which is when you have people together, the type of ideation that you have is very different from when you're connecting people on a purpose-based call. And so that is an element of the work process and the client interaction process that you're missing. And you know this, you study this for a living, so you should comment on this as well, is when you have a group of people and you're trying to either problem solve or create or figure out what's the right thing to do, there is a lot of informal communication that happens when people are together in a room. And that element is now missing. It's harder to read people on this format. In fact, somebody was telling me that even if you look at a normal human voice and the range of voice that you have, when people are on camera, naturally that range of voice becomes, more narrow, because you modulate yourself in a way that may be a bit artificial and less real. So I don't know, but what does academic research suggest about approaching human interactions in this format?
I love what you're saying. What was the term you used, Anu? Was it creative combustion?
Creative combustion, yes.
I love that. I love that notion. And as you were speaking, I was thinking a little bit about some research that I have seen and feel like it's a kind of a hallmark of what I tried to create in a classroom or in any of my work with faculty around maximizing a sense of psychological safety in a group. The idea here is not to create a space free of dissent and challenge, but in order to push a team, a class really far, to get them to innovate and to risk take, what you need to do is increase their sense of kind of trust and respect with one another, and thinking about how to maximize psychological safety in the way in which it gets a little flat. Our relationships get a little flattened by or shortened in some ways when you think about all the accidental kind of running into people when walking across campus, or the small talk before the session actually begins when you're early to the meeting room. These are the kinds of things that I've been thinking a little bit about, right? And so there are real challenges. I guess the one thing that I was thinking about was actually, in a number of those kind of group venues, is to call that out and just to say, how do we do it here? Can we try to approximate that? Because that's really important for us to do good work together. So even though this feels really artificial, can we still keep our eyes on those undergirding values that allow us to work together well over time? I'm not convinced we're always able to get there, but at least we keep an eye on the things that I think made us effective when we were face to face.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because even when you do get a group together, one of the things we've tried doing is if you have the group together for an hour, the 45 minutes is scheduled, but then the 15 is empty. So you leave some time, because otherwise you're going to finish one call and get on the other call. And I'm sure that is the lives of everyone who is on this, right? Which is in some way this culture, because everybody has been trapped in wherever it is they are. Sometimes work and demands on your time has extended. It starts really when you wake up and finishes when you go to sleep, and there is less delineation between personal time and work time. And so the number of hours that people are working has gone up. The human interconnectedness has gone down. And so the combination of that just adds to the stress, even without any of the environmental stress. All the other things you mentioned is the geopolitical uncertainty, the macroeconomic uncertainty, the health issues, the continuing COVID, the Black Lives Matter protests, all of that is happening around us. And then even if you keep all of that separate, an individual's personal and work life have gotten meshed in a way that has added to stress on every human being.
Sorry, I'm muting myself in between because my old Labrador is making some sounds during our session here
That
today,
is the
talking
cute.
about stress and improvisation and there not being a boundary between work and home.
Yeah.
Maybe this is a great way. It's one of the last questions I thought we might end on, but it feels to me like there's a calling to it just from the way our conversation has organically bubbles up. This notion of kind of the stress and the, increase in kind of demands at a point of, as you were saying, decreased interconnectivity and a great deal of stress and strain that people are experiencing. How are you managing the stress and burnout? So what are the ways in which you personally, or the ways in which you're encouraging your team to manage stress and burnout so that we can rejuvenate, so we can be resilient over time?
Yeah, I think one, so I'll maybe do it in kind of three pieces: what I do as a manager, what my team does, and maybe what I do as an individual, right? So I think as a manager, you have to remind yourself that there is that element, or at least I had to remind myself that there is a lot that you pick up when you are with your teams. When you're seeing them in the office or you're traveling with them, that is informally, you will learn things, you will pick up things. And when you're not seeing people, you don't know, because otherwise I can look at someone and say, oh, this person's not looking perky, I should check in with them. So I had to get very systematic and literally look at the list of all the people on my team and say, who is it that I haven't spoken to recently? And just call them in a very organized way. Like keep a list and check off, like saying, I haven't spoken to this guy or this girl in, for 2 weeks. And so I should just find out what is happening with them. Something that happens, I didn't have to think about it so much in normal pre-COVID life. And now I have to do it in a much more deliberate manner. And I think the second thing I had to learn to do is not everybody is as comfortable with this format. And so you can grab coffee with someone. And just like there are cultural differences where one type of person understands, okay, my manager is meeting me for coffee. That means, I should just go through and talk about what am I working on, what is going well, what is not, how can she help? And they'll just launch into it. Whereas some other people may say, okay, this is social and I'm going to wait and take the lead from her as to where does she want this conversation to go. In a virtual format, across cultures, because I manage a team globally, it's very different. The different people are comfortable, less comfortable, more comfortable speaking about what is really on their mind. And sometimes it may take 2 discussions or 3 discussions before you get to, is everything okay or not? And so that I think is more challenging. And when you do a group call, and this is something we decided that if you have more than 9 people, because most iPad screens will allow 9 squares on it. If you have more than 9, you're not watching everybody at the same time. So I can have 1 and 8 more. And in that, some will dominate the conversation because they are more comfortable speaking. So again, I feel like as a manager, I have to be very deliberate about calling on people, making sure that people have equal airtime. And if you know the people well enough, you know who needs more notice. So I can, if you are more comfortable speaking, I start with you, but then I say, I'm going to go name by name to each person. So the others are ready and they're thinking about what it is that they want to say. So a lot of kind of new tricks and tools on how it is that you think about managing a cross-cultural global team in an environment where, as you said, a lot of other things are not normal.
I really like that idea of the intentionality you're bringing to that work to maintain the connection and thinking in new and creative ways around how to still maintain the kernel of what is important, which is for your team members to feel valued, to be visible, right? To be connected to the work that you're doing together. I think that's really important. I think there's been a lot of, what I've found myself doing in these moments where I think, how can I possibly manage, a group of 26 in our monthly meeting on the Zoom, given some of the limitations and so on and so forth, has been to always go back to like, what is the philosophical underpinning? What is the really important thing that I need to pay attention to, right? And then how might I get there creatively through different modalities, or be kind of circumnavigate around the challenges that are in front of us at the current moment in time. And I think one way that, I agree, I think is so effective, is this notion of kind of feeling, making sure we don't lose sight of a sense of belongingness and connectedness, and making sure that even if it's mediated in some way through a quick, Google chat, that was a great point you made this morning, in stand-up meeting, or other ways of doing that, just connecting with a quick, 15-minute moment in time, or at the end of a team meeting, seems to me to be really important. And the other thing that I would say, I guess, is that I have, one of the things that I was trying to cultivate even before COVID happened, and I feel like it's been a lifeline for me during this period of time, is to cultivate gratitude, to make sure, no matter how aggravating my day might have been, or how upset I feel at either myself or the world at a moment, that I think about, at least, at the end of the day, reflect back and think of one good thing. And it's something that I've been trying to do regularly for both myself, and that it's something I brought to my team. And it happened just happenstance. At the end of the day, we're having one of those informal, right before everyone's going out the door, conversations. And we were focusing on some of the negative things that had happened. And I said, okay, let's stop this and each say one good thing from today. And it started to become a habit in our office that we would get together at the end of the day and someone would just say one good thing. And you'd all have to share, and you weren't allowed to not have one. You had to always have a good thing. So
That's a great idea. I love it.
Yeah. It's been very helpful. It has been. Yeah.
It's
So
forcing to see the positive, right?
trying. Yeah. And there is always one good thing. There is always at least one good thing. That was the interesting thing, that sometimes, you'd just shake up the conversation slightly, and then people would have a number of good things. And that was always really buoying to see. I guess, you were saying you were to answer that question kind of in multiple parts.
Yeah.
So you're talking about as a manager. How about you individually? What have you been doing?
Yeah, individually. So I do yoga, and I find that to be pretty, not just helpful, but I think necessary to kind of stay together. And I think connecting with people outside of who I need to connect with for work. So friends, family, and making an extra effort to stay connected to people. And I think, because you can drop that, right? Because my day can really go nonstop, and there's always something to do from a work perspective. So I use one calendar. I put everything into that. So even if it is call mom, that goes into my calendar. And so that life and work are managed on the same calendar, which I find to be helpful to maintain some semblance of balance in life.
I love that idea. It is true, right? That if it's not in the calendar, it's like it doesn't really exist, right? So there is a way in which just you can make real your commitments by those kinds of little tricks that you might do well in advance. Yeah, I love that idea. I guess one of the other things that often occurs to me, we were talking about how my area of research is perfectionism, and that's one that often resonates with our alums in a variety of ways. We think about what would make someone successful to get into Smith and at Smith, that are students who are really hard driving and hold themselves to really high standards and want to do really well. And I guess one of the things that I was wondering about is, how are you managing, your team and yourself in this moment in which things are so challenging? It's probably hard to demand the same level of exacting perfection or kind of humming along in a typical way. So how are you kind of, what's your mindset around, high standards and then falling a little short of them?
Mhm. So I guess I think about it a little bit less than standards and falling short, as opposed to what is the way of doing what we do in the current environment. So you can't take the exact same thing, the exact same way that we did previously, and make it work in the current environment. And so we had to adapt how we work and how we do things. So I run the mergers and acquisitions business, which is about giving our clients advice. So if you're giving clients advice, a big part of it, and the way we would describe it, is you are there with the client, you look them in the eye, and you're giving them advice and you're reading them. That whole element, it just went out the window. Can't do it. Can't get on a plane, can't travel, can't be in the same room as you. And even if I was going to be 6 feet away and wearing a mask. So, and if you had asked me in February, is it possible to run this business without ever being on a plane, without physically meeting with clients, I would have said no. Because that is what we all believed. Yet we have figured out a way to do this in this environment. Because finally, what are we? We are in a client service business, which means you have to be there for the client, which is very similar to any other relationship. Is they are not looking for you to have all the answers, because they don't and you don't. But you can help them think through it with them. And so that means more interactions with people. They may be shorter because it's not that I'm traveling somewhere and you have the ability to sit down and spend a whole day brainstorming and then go to dinner and then sleep on it and talk about it again the next morning. You don't have the ability to do that, but you can probably every week get together and collaborate more and brainstorm more in not all at the same time, but broken up into compartments. So I think how we work changed a lot. And I'd say just, even physically, like if there was something, we never thought much about get on a plane and tomorrow morning be in Europe and spend the day in Europe and then come back. Whereas now, when you can't do that, you find that there is a lot that you can accomplish without doing that. And in fact, you may have spent 18 hours on cars and trains and planes that you can actually use for something else. Our presentations have become shorter. It's more interactive, because if you're going to run through something on a screen, it's hard to go through 80 pages on the screen. It's more likely that you're going to do 10 or 15 pages, and they're going to be visually more impactful because it's easier to hold people's attention when you do it that way. So there's a lot, I'd say, that our business has changed and our clients have changed, and we've changed in response, because we are all trying to figure out the exact same thing, whether as an individual or as a company, is how is it that I can best navigate the world around me? How is it that I can deal with uncertainty? And how is it that I can protect the assets, the vision, the dream, the strategy, whatever it is, whether it's individual or company, that I had pre-COVID? And so when you simplify it to that, it's actually a lot less complicated than all corporate finance theory would tell you, because everybody, whether it's an individual or a company, is basically trying to address the same problem. And as long as you can be there for them and be solutions oriented and have the interest of our client at heart, you can get to the right answer, irrespective of whether you can be in the same room or even in the same country.
I like the notion of kind of leaning into the challenge or things that you think are real liabilities, and then kind of, I don't know, busting open your thinking using that creative combustion to figure out how to make that a thing that could spur on the innovation. I guess it makes me think a little bit about the literature and perfectionism, in that, there are really two pieces of it, and there's one piece that's unhealthy and another piece that's relatively healthy. And the unhealthy part is this fear of making mistakes, thinking that something is ruined if there's a mistake or if you fall short of a standard. The other part is setting excessively high standards for performance. So setting excessively high standards, that striving piece, not necessarily particularly harmful. It can be on occasion, but in many ways it can often be associated with positive outcomes. It's the concerns piece, worry, you're constantly being distracted by whether what you've done is good enough. And so I like that idea of actually taking a mistake and turning it into something positive. So rather than something to be feared and avoided at all costs, which is impossible, right? We're all inevitably imperfect and we're fallible. And so I love that notion, because it really then does shake up what is a real liability in mindset, right? Because this evaluative concerns piece is associated with all kinds of negative psychological outcomes like anxiety and depression on an individual level, and on a team, in work, it definitely hinders performance and interferes with kind of cohesion and all of those things. Yeah.
And also, I think it sets up a very unrealistic expectation, right? Because if you define what you're supposed to do as here is the problem, here is a solution, this is a problem that none of us could even imagine. And so to pretend that I know the exact solution for it is just a silly, right? It's much more to say, okay, we can't even fully understand the problem. So why don't we think about what is the best things we can do to navigate it, as opposed to here is the answer. So totally agree with you. I think if you set up your goal as I have to come up with the answer, that's a really bad goal to set yourself up for.
I wonder whether this is maybe a perfectionism busting moment where, I don't know about that necessarily. I can imagine some people are harder on themselves now. And I also want to acknowledge that there are like real objective stressors, financial and so forth, health, that people are experiencing that is hard to kind of positive, coping, think your way out of. But in some ways, I think you're right that there are ways in which, I've heard in so many spheres, we're doing the best we can. And that's resonating, I think, where people are being kind to one another about that as a way of saying, I don't have all the answers. And in many ways, it's felt like it's opened up possibilities to feel like it's I don't know, there's more of an opportunity to connect with other people around that vulnerability and fallibility that I don't think we ordinarily get, which is that we have the veneer of professional, perfection and competence and expertise that doesn't allow windows into that part of what is deep-seated we're all dealing with. And so it's an interesting phenomenon, I think.
Yeah, because I mean the type, because normally obviously we're talking about advising companies on whether it's M&A or financing or capital markets or something like that. But nowadays I was having as many conversations about what is your office building doing for HVAC and making sure that the air circulation in the buildings is more. How many people are you bringing in? How are you figuring out the safety of your employees? Or in the summer, we did a thing of, normally we'd get our whole group together and do something. And instead it's like, okay, can we design some fun game or something that we can have the whole group play? And do we say, like, what time of day do we do it? Because people could still go outside. So do we do something where everybody has like a blanket and some fruits and cheese and you can go sit outside and still connect? And so we just had to find different ways to connect with people that are responsive to the current environment, but there's no rule book for how to do it. But as long as people care, whether you care about your employees or you care about your clients, that comes through. So not perfection, but do you truly care, and are you motivated to help me figure out the solution as opposed to give me the answer?
You know, the other thing that occurs to me from what you're saying, Anu, that I think has also been really interesting when I watched the move to remote learning at the college, and that resulted in us kind of picking up and thinking about everything from how do you actually conduct graduation? What is our grading policy going to be? How do we engage in all our prospective student events that we usually do? And so there were so many ways in which we needed to rethink virtually everything that we had done. So in some ways, I was saying to individuals with whom I've worked, it felt to me like we were building a university from the ground up, because none of the old translated well to the new. And so every time you pull, it was almost thread pulling, right? You pulled a thread and you thought, as soon as we changed to remote, do we change the grading policy? Do we change credits? Do we change deadlines? Yeah. And so we, you know, in essence, that was really useful. Like the focus on the process, like what it is that was actually in scope, was really useful for letting people to feel, I think, kinder to themselves too, about what we were doing. And if we didn't have an answer, if someone said, well, what do you say about X policy or procedure? We were able to say, we haven't gotten to that yet, but thank you for bringing it to our attention. And so it was something that was done much more collaboratively. And I like what you were saying about, it seems like this is resonating. I'm looking in the chat with this notion of, I don't have all the answers, but let's sit and problem solve through it together. Let's inquire about it. How should we think about this? I think people are liking that notion of kind of process.
Yeah, and just like I think you talked about Smith and education, and I think what is the future of education? Likewise, we spend a lot of time thinking about what is the future of work. Does everybody have to live in the same city? Do we have the ability to actually have people across more locations who sometimes come together in one location, but not all the time? And do we have the ability for more flexible work, ways of working? And I think that's particularly relevant for a lot of women who were leaving this job and profession mid-career, and we were losing a lot of talent. And if there could be some flexibility in this, which historically just our imagination didn't run to that. And now we, if you have to find some silver lining in this, one of the good things is proving to ourselves and proving to everybody that you can actually do this working from home. You can get a lot done without travel. And this allows us to widen the funnel of talent that we are attracting and retaining and keeping in this business. And that, I think, is a change that I want to hold on to, is a learning from this process that is one of the few things I'm excited about, that is something we've now figured out. And what does that mean for the future of work? The flexibility, the broader talent base that you can use, the retention element of it, and the ability to go look at multiple places to find that talent. Because everything doesn't need to be in New York or San Francisco or London or Frankfurt. I can look a lot broader in terms of finding that talent.
I love this topic, and there's even a query about it in the sidebar here in the chat, which has to do with, the increasing attention about kind of the inequity, the inequitable outcomes that have been brought by COVID. And, I started off talking like, are there challenges and also opportunities? And you've just defined one in your sector, right? This notion that if you change the way you do business, it may be that you change the kind of inclusivity of the kinds of people who would do the work. I guess, what are your comments or observations about all that has been said in the media about the ways in which women are disproportionately impacted at the current moment, and how people of color may be disproportionately impacted? And I don't know if you have any other words of wisdom about how this might show there may be some promise for addressing some of these issues in the long term.
Yeah, I think some of the social inequalities existed, but I think this time has cast the spotlight on it in a way that makes it impossible for people not to notice it. So I don't think the inequalities are new or that they didn't exist before. They existed, but I think the current environment has magnified it. And it's at different levels, right? Some are, we use the term micro inequities, and some are like broader. It's even as simple as, we tell everyone switch on your videos and be on it. For some people, it may not be comfortable to show everybody what is the home environment that I live in, because maybe you don't want that to be seen, right? And whereas it may be very stark that you may see some people living in these fabulous homes, and then there are some other people, because normally you don't see that. You see everybody in their work environment. And now your personal inequity and background inequity is magnified and shown to the world because of this format. So that part of it, actually, I don't like, right? Because I don't think everybody is as comfortable sharing that. And there is a equalization that happens when everybody is in the same place, like in the office, and you all have the same type of desk and you're sitting there, and that there's an equalization that goes away when we see you and when everybody sees each other in their home environment. That is a micro version of what I'm talking about. Broadly in the society, it is, again, the difference is very stark, because we talk about it as the difference between the market economy and the real economy. Because you can look at the stock markets and the market economy, and for many people, it feels like it is disconnected with the real economy. Because when you anecdotally go company by company and say, what are all the challenges that each company has had to face, whether you had to furlough people, or whether you had to shut down the number of stores that you had, or restaurants, or reduce the number of workforce, or the number of orders that you're getting are going down, and that has financial implications for the whole company. That is very different from how is that company or that sector valued in the market. And that's a very hard thing to resolve. It's a very hard thing to resolve, particularly in corporate America. So I do think that companies, leadership of companies, the C-suite and boards have to think about both economies. Yes, if you're a public company, you have to work in the interest of your shareholders, and you have to think about that. But when you have to think about long-term value, and what does that mean? That also means creating a company in a way that has a long-term future and is value enhancing to its customers, stakeholders, and the community. And that's much harder. And that, I think, is going to be a lot more challenging, because the impact that these 7-8 months have had, while things have, as I started, I think while we've managed a lot better than what anybody else would have thought we would be able to do under these circumstances, the real pain about some of the actions that was taken to manage will be felt for longer, unless you have the growth to come out of it, and a growth that is equitably distributed across the broad population. And that's going to be very hard, which is why it's really important what public policy is. It's really important what actions, and not just the government, but the public sector and the private sector takes over the next 2-3 years, because that could determine not just the future of corporate America, but the people of America.
I really liked what you were saying too, when you were saying that where you started in saying that it's not that the inequities didn't exist, it's just that they're exposed in a much broader, starker fashion that
Yeah.
is causing a number of people to take a step back, potentially never having seen some of these inequities or been at quite as exquisitely aware of them. And I think that one thing that I've seen that's rippled across campus for us has been, our students come from a variety of backgrounds, right? We recruit women of promise for lives of distinction, but having all of them on campus does help, in some ways cover over some of those inequities. And then also, all of the ways in which their families and they themselves are differentially situated in the midst of this pandemic is revealing, I think, to a much broader swath than ever before of faculty around the ways in which this is something that needs to be embedded in what we do every day and not just on Zoom, right?
Yeah.
But in an ongoing and sustained way. And this is a conversation that many faculty have been having at Smith for years, but it feels to me, this round of conversations feels different. It feels like a much broader coalition of faculty at Smith who are willing to roll up their sleeves and do the work, and not just at the current moment to make it through this, remote learning moment, but rather to say, how do I do this work well, given the heterogeneity of what our students are, bringing into my classroom. So I see that as a real challenge that I think we can leverage into an opportunity. And I think that the earnestness and again, maybe the vulnerability that people have been bringing to that conversation to say, I knew, but I never really knew. And until this recent pandemic that has caused, I think, our faculty to respond very differently than they would in an ordinary semester to their students.
Yeah. I think even having all the conversations about race, which again, as an immigrant to the country, I was originally a little, at Smith, you talked about everything. But then you come out of Smith, race was a topic that people didn't talk about. And now we are talking about it in a very deliberate way, which is so important because it helps people understand each other better. And it's not the solution, but it's the beginning of getting to a potential solution. And that, I think, is a big change that has happened in this time period, where it has become not just acceptable, but necessary to have that conversation, and more people are having the conversation. So maybe it is taking a leaf out of what you said, is trying to think of some positives. Is if I had to think about some of the positives that have come out of this time period, it's not a lot, but there are some. And what is important is that we build on it and leverage it and not let it go.
I guess maybe one more question that I saw in the chat had to do with, how do you turn a mistake into a positive? So that is a great segue from what you were just saying, just discussing. How do you turn something into a positive? I guess, how do you react? So looking back on maybe a mistake that you've made or experienced at some point in time, what was the way you've turned that into productive learning moment, a way to propel your development as a person or, work professional?
I think one is just accepting, whether in yourself or in others, that mistakes will happen, and to say that there should never, like, I can never make a mistake. If anybody starts believing that in itself is a mistake, right? So and then it's a question of, how do you react to it if you made it? How does somebody else react to it when you say you made a mistake, and how do you react to other people telling you that you made a mistake? And again, in a professional setting, it's a high bar, right? So it's not that you don't recognize the importance of the high bar, but you also recognize that all these things can happen, and you need to figure out whether there was something that was fundamental or whether it was like a one-off. So I think that's the first thing we look at to say, do we have a fundamental problem, or is this like a normal human regular mistake, something that can happen and it's not a fault in process or system or procedures or bad intent? And that is hard to evaluate as a manager, to look at all these and say, where does it fit in? Does it fit in, which requires some sort of policy change, procedural change? Is the person a bad actor? And does that require addressing? Or is it just, it happened, and so how do we deal with that? And so I'd say that's the first part, is determining that. And when it is in the last piece, which is, it was not policy, it was not procedures, it was not a bad actor, it was just a genuine, well-meaning person who did everything right, something bad happened. I think at that time you have to react with humanity and compassion, and when someone does that, and all of us, I'm sure, have examples of that, right? You remember that moment when you made a mistake and feel terrible, and you're really afraid of even going and admitting it, and how the person that you admitted it to reacts, I think has a lifelong impact on how you approach candor and comfort with going and admitting in the future. And so it's very important to me to create a culture which values excellence, but doesn't, or puts our head in the sand and pretends that it'll happen all the time by itself. And if you have an environment where people are afraid of admitting that they did something wrong, that's it. You're done, right? Because that means you will then you have to have all this, processes to catch things. And that's a very bad way. That's a very bad way to run things. Instead, if everybody feels a sense of ownership over what they do, you genuinely feel bad when you make a mistake. And if you share that and you can learn from that without making an example of it. This is, again, in cases where people are not a bad actor and procedures and policies are not wrong and things like that, because we're in financial services. So sometimes if it's procedure, policy, bad actor, you have to do something about it. But I'm talking about more kind of genuine mistakes. And I think I was very influenced by my early years in my career, when if I did something, whatever, I made a mistake in modeling or linked some cell wrong, and I went and told somebody, hey, I did this and we need to fix it, how they reacted to it was extremely influential for me. Because because the person that I worked for at that time was one level above me, kind of said, okay, let's fix it first, and then we'll go jointly and own up to it. Because if you made a mistake, I also made a mistake because I didn't catch it. And that camaraderie that it builds, and we are in this together, and it's not like, he turned around and told me like, it's your fault and you go now and own up and your job is on the line, which has happened to other people. But I think that in my formative years, how I was treated influenced a lot how I've approached it, both as an individual and a manager. And that's why I say that for people who are starting out in this profession, it is supremely important as to how it is that you give that message. The message is not, oh, you can make mistakes, no problem, it's okay. That's not the message. The message is that, people trust you with enormous decisions, and it's extremely important to be careful and get it right. But it's also human to make mistakes. So check, cross-check. And when you find something, the most important thing is you immediately let people know. Because not letting people know is much more costly than letting people know and fixing it. And so I think that's a message which we keep trying to convey, and hopefully it resonates and gets through.
Well, I think that's true across sectors. What you were saying for me, I think is a lovely place maybe for us to wrap up, which is that there is the capacity to have both kind of a really high bar in terms of excellence and expectation, and still be human, and kind of accepting and supportive and forgiving when we fall somewhat short, and that you presented a lovely model for doing that with humility. Thank you, Anu. I don't know if you have any last minute thoughts before we wrap up. I think, Amy, you had some housekeeping things you wanted to share with us, but this has been a lovely, thank you, lovely time together. Really appreciate your insights.
Enjoyed chatting with you, and I think this is I guess thank you to Smith for thinking about this topic, because I think this is relevant for everybody across sectors. I'm not, when I'm having a conversation, I can't also read the chat, so I didn't read it. So sorry, there's some question that came on it, but I will go back and read it. So thank you.